already. Just to get an idea before we start, I think there are three main groups of people here. There are some students, there are some academic staff, and there are some people from organizations outside. Just have a show of hands so that our guest speakers can see. How many are from outside the university? How many of you are from organizations outside the university? Two. Okay. And how many are students? How many academic staff? Okay, right. Okay, good. Well, thanks very much for coming along. I think there will be people joining us because it's still teaching time. So some people joining for the various parts. But I just want to give you a sort of background to the seminar and also tell you a little bit about how we plan to organize it. We have more speakers than usual for one of these seminars. This is, I think, the third in the series of land-related seminars that RCSP is hosting. And this is going to be a completely international seminar. Many of the seminars in this program are international across the Mekong region, but this will actually be broader. Our guests, who I'll introduce in a moment, are from Brazil, Colombia, and Australia. And the idea of this afternoon's program is to look at the ways in which we both have common issues around land justice and food sovereignty, but also to try to look at the more specific and sometimes different ways in which we understand, frame, and deal with those issues in a different regional context. So the common issues and threats around land justice and land sovereignty have to do with transnational agribusiness, land grabbing, loss of food sovereignty, the encroachment on land. Sometimes you could say the sort of negative land reforms, as we see land increasingly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy at the expense of the poor, the opposite of what we often understand by land reform. These are common phenomena around the world, in particular since the food crisis in 2008, the theme of land grabbing has been a global concern. And there's also global connections in the response and resistance to those. So our group yesterday was visiting a case where there has been occupation of land, which is not dissimilar to what's been happening for a long time in Brazil under the movement of landless workers, the MST. So there was a commonality of resistance. But at the same time, in each world region, the language we use to talk about land grabbing, but also the histories and the structural basis for agrarian relations is quite specific to individual countries, but also to different regions. So what we want to do this afternoon is to explore the ways in which we talk about, study, and deal with these issues in Latin America, Australia, and Southeast Asia, both in terms of the concepts and the conceptual language that we use to frame our studies and action, and also to look at some of the comparative reality. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, before we break halfway through, we're going to start with 4 presentations from Professor Bernardo Manzano Fernandez from the State University of Sao Paulo, who, like me, is a geographer and has been working for 30 years or more with MST, with the Landless Workers Movement, who also helped set up and run a school for the MST, as well as his position, or as part of his position at State University of Sao Paulo. Also 2 postdoctoral fellows who work with Bernardo, Thais from Thais Lombardi from the University of Sao Paulo from Brazil, who has worked a lot in the Amazon, and among other comparative aspects has a lot, I guess, to share with us in terms of the way we talk about the Mekong and issues there. And also Felipe Riton from who's a postdoctoral researcher who works with Bernardo, but is from Colombia and has worked in a number of countries in Latin America and also in Mozambique in Africa. Also we have from the University of Sydney, Alana Mann, who is in media and communication, but has done a lot of work via Campesina, and who writes in particular about food sovereignty, including some very interesting work on urban food sovereignty in Sydney. So we sometimes think in terms of the global south, in terms of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. But I think it's important to bring other world regions in, and it'll be interesting to hear from you about how you present the issue with respect to Australia. Also my colleague Jeff Nielsen, who's the geographer from the School of Geosciences at Sydney University as well, and works on land reform and food issues in Indonesia. He's been doing so for many years. So we're going to run it. There'll be 4 presentations from outside Southeast Asia, then we'll have a bit of a break. And then Jeff and I will give some comparative comments, just looking at the ways in which the concepts and the experiences that you bring from other world regions can help us think about processes we're familiar with in Southeast Asia, but also to consider some of the differences and the ways in which the concepts are actually shaped by the realities that you face on the ground. And then Ajahn Trusak will give some overall remarks, reflections, and then we can open it up for discussion later on. So can we start with you, Bernardo?
I start.
We have to present on
from there?
Please, yeah, please. From there.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to debate about our countries, about the food sovereignty, land grabbing, the right question, and for me it's a good opportunity because it's my first time in Thailand, and yesterday we have a field work, and Thais and Felipe, Alana, Jeff, we can to know a little bit about the Thai reality in the countryside. And my presentation is introducing the agrarian question in Brazil. I prepared one presentation where I speak about a little bit the history about the agrarian question in Brazil, and the main concept that I work in my research. Is here? Yeah. No.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I start with the colonization in Brazil in the 16th century by the Portuguese colonization, and my country was colony after the colony was empire because we created with the independence, we created an empire for some decades, and after we are republic. In this process, Brazil was a big plantation, and they produced commodity, sugarcane, and coffee, and the gold, the mineral, the mining commodity, and the agriculture commodity. The first workers in Brazil was aborigines, was slavery, and the African people from the 16th to 19th century. For 4th century, this was the kind of the work in Brazil. In 1815, we have the land law, and we created the private property. And in the 1888, we had the slave liberation. It's very interesting because when we have the first landowner, the first captive the land, prohibit the access to land. After they prohibit the access to land, they make a liberation of the slaves. Well, these two acts create a population, a landless population in my country. We finished in the 19th century, we have the first Peasant War in Brazil. And they start the 20th century, we have a new Peasant War. This two Peasant War is against the control of the territory by landowners. After this process with the slave liberation, we received in our country many European and Asian immigrants. These peoples, Aborigine, African, European and Asian immigrants, formed the Brazilian people. We are a mix of these peoples. The plantation and commodities is our history. Aboriginal, African, European, and Asian formed the Brazilian peasants. In this process, plantations against the peasants created territorial disputes in Brazil. Because this we have two peasants war, and until today we have many territorial disputes. I understand the territory, or better, I understand the land is a territory. How I understand the land has a territory? Because the land is a fraction of the territory. I work the idea of the territory, but my country is my territory, but my land is part of my country. So my land is my territory. In this process, in two centuries, we have the territorialization. The territorialization, I understand the multiplication of the territory. For example, when we create the private property, when you buy one property, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 property, you make a process of territorialization. And when you buy many property, you make the territorialization. The territorialization is a decrease of territory. But who has decreased the territory? Aboriginal peoples or indigenous peoples. Peasants peoples, the peoples, the more weak peoples in the relation of the power. Well, I understand the territory. Sorry, I need to presentation my concept. Okay, I understand the territory is same the space. Space and territory is the same. The space is a materialization of existence. Okay, the space is not the surface. It's not only the ground, it's not only area. The space is multidimensional. I am space. I am territory. My idea are space.
is space. My idea is territory. So I work with this concept. I work with the territoriality. Territoriality is the different relationship in the use of the territory. So, if the territoriality is a different relationship in the use of the territory, different relationships produce different territories. So, the one corporation produces one kind of territory. The peasants produce another kind of territory. So, in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, we change our agrarian question. We have plantations, we have commodities, but now we have agribusiness. Agribusiness make a revolution in the process of the plantations and commodities, because the agribusiness create a complex of the systems, and agribusiness make a big process to export for China, for United States, for Europe, for Japan, and we create, we make a big process of territorialization in Brazil. So, if you have territorialization, territorial disputes, if we have different relationship, we have different relationships produce different territories and different paradigms. We can to read this process from different sources. The Green Revolution territorialized agribusiness in the world. Our countries, we have many corporations that control the land, that control the process of production. This process make the territorialization of the peasants. When you make the territorialization of the peasants, you create a big struggle for land and agrarian reform. In Brazil, we start this process in the middle of the last century. The Peasant Movement were born in Brazil more or less in middle of the 20th century. The Christian movement is a peasant league. After this, we have the Union Peasant and the MST, the landless movement, is a more important movement today in Brazil. So we have the territorial disputes because the corporations and the peasants and the indigenous peoples struggle for land. Disputes the land, disputes the territory. This dispute of territory create the disputes of paradigmatic debates, or we dispute different models of development for our countries. So we have plantations, commodities, peasants, and agribusiness. This is a main elements or components of the agrarian question in Brazil. For we read the paradigmatic debate, I present the main source of this method of analysis. For example, we have today two paradigms to read the reality of our countryside, of our countries. We have the agrarian question paradigm. Many people here studies Marx and Kautsky. Marx in general is a seminal, is a main. Marx produced the main ideas about the one lecture about the capitalism, and the Kautsky organized this idea and explained the agrarian question into the capitalism. What is agrarian question? Agrarian question is land capitalized rent. When the peasant produce and sell, the capitalism appropriate the more part of the rent produced by work of the peasants. when the capitalism appropriate of the rent, the capitalism create a differentiation between the peasants. We have the poor, middle, and rich peasants. Well, because this, in one word, the peasants struggle against the capital. We have, in 20th century, we have one war, peasant war in Brazil, but we have many peasants war in the world. And today, we have the peasant make a resistance against deterritorialization, against the subordination for the plantations for the agribusiness. This book of Kautsky was published in the end of the 19th century. But in the middle of 20th century, we have a new book with a new explanation about the agrarian question. We have the agrarian capitalism paradigm. Agrarian capitalism paradigm start with the Smith, Adam Smith, the man in general, and Henri Mendras is a French sociologist in particular. What is agrarian capitalism paradigm? For the agrarian capitalism paradigm, the peasant is an incomplete economy. The peasant needs to subordinate into the capitalism. But when the peasant subordinate to the capitalism economy, or the capitalism economy, the peasants suffering a metamorphosis. The peasant is transformed in the farm, is another person, is a professional, is a producer. And the peasants in this context work with the capital, not struggle against the capital. So we have here two paradigms, two models of explanation. So we create this scheme. We have two paradigms, the agrarian custom paradigm and the agrarian capitalism paradigm. The agrarian custom paradigm have two trends. One trend is the peasant agriculture. In this vision, the peasant agriculture has future, is very strategic to development our countries. And another trend is a proletarization. In this trend, the peasant no has future because the capitalism dominate the production model of the peasant and destroy the peasant. Into the agrarian capitalism paradigm, we have two trends. One trend is a family farm. For family farm, the peasant is very important, but they not use the concept of peasant, they use the family farm. And in this concept, the family farm is very important for developing the capitalism. In this vision, the peasant is very important for struggle against the capitalism, because the capitalism makes a differentialization. In this vision, the family farm is very important for work with the capital. Another trend about the agrarian capitalism paradigm is agribusiness. For agribusiness, this family farm is not enough. The family farm is not important. The agribusiness is the hegemonic model, and agribusiness not need the family farm, not need the peasant, because this model is more important, more enough, more efficient. Well, here we have two paradigm disputes. In my country, when we have left the government with the left position, we have a post-neoliberal government. The post-neoliberal government work in this overlap zone, is a contact zone. So we have public policies for the peasant, for the family farm, but it's the same persons, and we have public policies for this agribusiness. But when we have the neoliberal government, we haven't the public policy for these peoples. We haven't agrarian reform, but the more part of the money is directed to agribusiness. Well, this creates a terrible reality. For example, we create accumulation by dispossession with exploitation by pollution. When the Brazilian government creates one region for the land grabbing, the north of the Brazil, the state of Tocantins, Maranhão, Bahia, Piauí, in this region, India, China, Arab countries, and the United States, Japan, buy land and produce soy and produce corn for exportation. And they use pesticide a lot. They make pollution in the rivers. They deterritorize the peasants and another traditional people. The Thais speak about this in her presentation. We have a region with 730 million of hectares for the international capital. We have here the binomial latifundio and agribusiness with over-accumulation, with financialization, and everything to produce for export. Create the intensification of centralization of agro-extractivism, and create an agrarian question in new liberalism and post-liberalism time that Brazil live today. Here I have this region. Here I have the number of the conflicts in the last 10 years between the corporations and the peasants, indigenous peoples in disputes of the land in this region. Another kind is about the MST and Delmont in another state. This is very interesting because the peasants in Brazil struggle against the plantations, against the latifund. But now, the new agrarian question, the peasants start the struggle against the corporations, the big corporations. Here we have an example about the Ceará states when the Delmont produce banana and export to United States and Europe. Okay? It's very interesting because the MST create a first encampment in this area and dispute the area with Delmont and create a new struggle of land in Brazil. Here, the banana and papaya with irrigation, and we have 2,000 hectares in this area. And here we have the area by Delmont and the occupation of MST. The MST territory and the MST and the Delmont territory. This is an example of territorial disputes. For finishing, we have many conflicts in Brazil. Each one of the cycle is a kind of conflict. We have, this is Amazon region, the many conflicts. This is a land conquest. We have today, in the last 30 years, we have 1 million of the family, landless family, conquest the land. So, the peasant territory today in Brazil represents 24%. So the land, the agribusiness control 76% of the territory. From the paradigmatic debate, we need to debate about the model of development for the peasant, because the agribusiness model of development is not enough, is not important for the peasant. Peasant work with another model, another relationship. So we need to create public policies for creating agroecology, food sovereignty against land grabbing in our country. We need to create the territory markets. What is the territory markets? We believe the market today is not only capitalist market. We can to create another kind of the markets. We create popular markets, we create institutional markets, and we can to create quota markets. Or, for example, we control 24% of the territory, but we don't control the market. We need to control the market. We need to control, we need to create a policy to create a market, or peasant markets. And we need to appropriate the technology for a small scale, technology for the production of the agroecology. We need to create conditions for the second phase of post-neoliberal in Brazil. Because today, or in this moment, the government is a neoliberal, and for the neoliberal government, no have space for this kind of the politics. So we need to change. We need to create, we need to prepare the condition for the next future. So I think we have here a small presentation about our reality and about the main concept that we work. Okay? Thank you.
A very big presentation, and I've known Bernardo for some years now, and this is actually a wonderful encapsulation of everything that you're working on. There's a great deal we need to unpack here, I think, by way of concepts of history and also of terminology, because there are some terms like territory and territorialization, which we also are familiar with, but which we might use in kind of different ways. And that, I think finding a common language also means looking at how the same terms come from different histories, different contexts. The way you talk about territory and space, both in terms of, if you like, land and nation as territory, but also maybe more metaphorical territory of the political space, and even markets as a kind of territory, or self as a kind of territory. So I think we'll have a very real basis already for a very rich discussion. And but since we do have four presentations, I think it's better if we take all those first, and then we open up at the end, and it's all on the table. So maybe to continue from Brazil, could I ask Thais Lombardi if you could come and present maybe is it more on the Amazon that you're talking about?
Actually, no, I'm just complimenting Bernardo.
Okay,
and I have a little bit of more. Thank you so much for having me here. I really want to thank, before we start, to Tabitha and Phil and for all of you, because it's a great opportunity to really understand. Well, I'm an anthropologist, and so I do like to understand better what's happening all over the world and all the context that, for me, it's really important to get what's actually going on. So I'm just complementing what Bernardo was saying. He was talking really about more the peasant movement, and I'm unpacking that a little to show you how the peasantry itself is not just one political group, but it's also, it's a kind of divide between the peasantry and the indigenous and traditional population. So I don't know if I can go, if I go too fast, please stop and ask me to go slowly. So just present to you what I'm dealing on, what I'm calling politics of recognition, and unpack a little bit the difference between the peasants and the traditional indigenous population, bring some example of Brazil and some Latin American context, and mainly about how territorial rights are being given to this traditional and indigenous population. So as most of the context is really well known for you about this politics of recognition, is about recognizing basic rights for the indigenous and traditional population. The problem with that is that this population for a long, long time is being understood as the underdeveloped part of the population that needs to be integrated in the overall society. And so, in a way, most of the bills and laws and rights for this population is some kind of a patronage laws. Like we, state government, we are so developed much more than this population, so we are kind of take care of them. And so as Latin America as a whole has this trend of treat this population as a population that needs to be taken care of. What is happening, and also because there was so much inequality and they were at the bottom down of inequality, really the bottom down, mostly this indigenous population. And for the whole Latin America is the kind of population that was just excluded from the process, mainly because the colonization process that has been happened through the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. What means that people from Europe mainly had come to the continent and just push these people away or bring them into the system, but as workers, like low works, and so very bad paid, or even this get more complicated when they had the indigenous population and also a huge slave traffic coming from Africa particularly. So it makes a little bit more complicated as you don't get the indigenous populations, not just the autochthonous population, but also this slavery descent, this Afro descent population that comes because of the huge, terrible slave trade that we had all over the continent. So most of the times what we have been trying to unpack is that how this, the peasants and this concept of ethnicity and race that are around the questions of this traditional indigenous population. They are quite close and mainly most of the times overlap, and sometimes they are completely different. The main difference is that the traditional population claim ethnicity as part of their rights. And most of the peasants are getting just the political position of it. So being a peasant is a political position, while and this political position requires some attitude towards policies and demands for the government and for the overall society, while the whole debate over ethnicity and race, it's mainly based as also as a political position, but in a lot of the dimensions. So ancestry is one of the dimensions, and self-identification and language or geographical location as other dimensions that would be huge differentiations of this, the way they frame their struggle for their rights and their recognition. So, and also the whole debate over the ethnicity and race at the continent would be framed over the phenotype and cultural traits. What's really, really interesting while peasants also have their traditional practice very valued and throw as one thing to make them different from, for example, what's being practiced as agriculture for agribusiness, and they have this political position, they don't claim for a culture of their own, like their traditional practice or traditional knowledge, what is very much embedded in this ethnicity discourse, and also this, so that makes a little bit of difference. So most of this recognition policies that we have nowadays being pushed by this type of population will be around official data, like being included in census and other government papers, as and sometimes documents as like, I want to be recognized as a quilombola, that is Afro-descent population in Brazil, or I want to be recognized like in the Colombia census, being from Palenque, for example. That's another more mainly black area, right? Yeah. And also, so this official data and the ethno-racial categories, but also what's really important for them is having their title, territorial rights, land title, all communal title. They don't want like individual for each of the person, each of the family, but they want the communal title. Some language special schools, that is a real trend, the whole Latin America. Health services, and also immaterial heritage and material heritage. And here comes the real thing about food and seeds and the preparation, and how it connects really deeply with the food sovereignty discourse, and how the dialogue has been really deepened with the peasants movement, for example, is around the foods and seeds preparation and this knowledge that they have about the environment and how to do some things. So what most of the social movements are trying to bring together, to join these two groups, it's all around territory, food, and so territorial rights, food sovereignty, the political aspects of ethnicity and land use. So on one side, we have these categories and how they are being operated as possible dialogues between the two social movements that have been for some times put aside, but they're trying to bring together and build a collaboration to try to maybe enhance their demands. What else? So a little quick about how this frontier expansion has been happening in Brazil. So the first arrows, let me see if it works. Yeah, so this first arrows is like since the starting of the colonization. So if you can see, it starts of course on the coast, and then from some points in the coast into the countryside. Until the early 20s, mainly this area of the country was actually destroyed by colonization. And so most of this traditional population was actually moved, and they were trying to flee from the oppression that was happening over here and just moving to the north of the country. And the second wave would be what a push for the government called March for the West, because this area was called as empty land. Okay, for Australia it seems really empty land. So as of course everybody was here, and so all the other parts in the center, west, and north, there was nothing. My time has run over. Sorry, I'm just finishing. And the last one, this last one, is what's going on over there right now. This blue ones, it's not really good color, but it's better on the computer. This last one is not just what's happening with the population, but it's the flow of capital. So the capital have been moving from the south to the center, west, and north. What is what we call the frontier expansion of beef and soy production mainly, and also corn but also what Bernardo was talking about, the Mato Pico region that you can see over there, that is just moving from the northeast and try to grab those lands that is still called empty lands, and so they need to be developed, what means bring agribusiness to those places over there. So this is just a quotation on what we have been based our definition of traditional population. I should just read it really quick. Traditional populations are a group that have been recognized or struggle to have recognized daily or on daily life or symbolic a public conservationist identity that includes some of the following characteristics: low impact environmental techniques use, equitable practice of social organization, existence of local institutions that can enforce the law, customary or not, local leadership, and to finish, select cultural traits that are reassured and re-elaborated. Should be clear by now that the category traditional population is occupied by political subjects that are willing to take over this agency, that is to say, willing to construct a pact, be compromised to a series of conservation practice in exchange of some benefits and overall territorial rights. And this is all the land titling that we have at the moment in Brazil. That's called indigenous lands and Quilombolas lands. So the indigenous population is, of course, the autochthonous population that already live in the country. And as you can see, there's small dots over here, is small areas where this population get this communal title of the land. And the green ones are the indigenous, and the red ones are the Quilombolas, that are the African descent population. One thing that might be said, and that's a very interesting example of why traditional and indigenous population, is that Quilombolas are African descent population, but they have cultural traits that they call as part of their identity. And so, therefore, that gives them the possibility to access some rights, to territorial rights, especially schools, and also their rights to their languages and identity. While for most of the Afro-descent population in the country that doesn't recognize themselves as being part of this special cultural community, they are just part of the Black movement in the country, and they don't demand land as a part of their demands to the state. They demand other rights, like rights to health or education, but they don't want a particular ways of being educated and access health service or even access land. While all this titling is communal, what means that the government give the title to the community. So if you have a son or a daughter, the son and daughter can continue on the land, and they can leave the land, or they can stay in the land, but you don't have individual plots dividing your land. You have a committee that decides how this land is going to be used, and if it's going to be used, and who, and maintain some traditional practice inside the community. I would like just to brief you about some differences between, and some commonalities between Brazil and Chile and Costa Rica. Really briefly. So for Brazil, it's a common titling, and you have just for this Chi population, indigenous population, and Quilombolas population. Other traditional population as the coastal villagers or the people in other areas are trying to get their land based on that, but they are still in a struggle. And yes, it was a tired, long bureaucratic process to give territorial recognition. Some of these lands, especially for the indigenous lands, the process has been over for more than 20 years since the law passed. And so they still don't have their title. Although they live in the land, they don't have their title, and with the coup in 2016, they are threatened to lose their land because the process hasn't been finished. And even for the ones that has the title, the government has this brilliant idea of pass a law that they have the permission to change the limits of the areas. So they're, even if you have the title, the government are trying to changing it a bit. So even have rights doesn't protect you from being threatened to lose your land. In Chile, you just have some indigenous territory, and what's interesting thing about Chile is that different from Brazil, that the population can claim that this plot of land is our plot of land, but we lived over here in the past, but we are not living here now because we were dispossessed. In Chile, this titling starts mapping where population were and just titling over. So yeah, okay, here we have indigenous population, and so yeah, but let's make a park over here, kind of a indigenous park. It's so different from Brazil that the population made the claims of where is their territory. In Chile, it was more state-based from top to bottom, and say, well, you live here, so we're gonna give you the title at this place. And Costa Rica, also a very top-down proposal, that is the Planes de Ordenamiento Territorial. Also, just for indigenous territory, no other traditional population being recognized, and in this case, actually, the overlap between indigenous population and traditional population is total. And also, it's a communal titling, but the state kind of decides where it should be used as possible territories of the state to be used as indigenous lands, and so very top down. So how access rights, even if you have this possibility of access rights, sometimes does not go with your traditional practice or the possibility or continue being the community you always have been, and of course not bringing any security on the process. And that's it. I'm sorry for being too fast, but I'm trying to get some time for. And so thank you. And Kapunka? Yeah.
Thanks, Thais. Well, again, I mean, many sort of points of interesting comparison and consideration, especially around this issue of politics of recognition and looking at how closely tied those are with aspects of land and territory, and maybe sort of sorting out what we mean by each of land and the broader concepts of territory. But again, let's put that point of thinking and discussion later on. And now let's move on to a bit further north to Colombia, but of course, as I said before. Pardon?
Finish Latin America.
Yes. As I said, Felipe has been working in his own country, Colombia, but also in Brazil with this team, and even in Mozambique in Africa.
Yeah, but okay. Hello, everyone. My presentation today is about Colombian new agrarian question on new elements about that start with the in the post-conflict phase that Colombia is living right now. Okay, I will try to be very well, not spend much time because we don't have. But well, the Colombian rural sector has been determined for most of the 5 decades of the rural decades of the internal armed conflict. The internal armed conflict in Colombia is based or was based really in an agrarian question, by the access to the land and the dispossession for small family farming of peasant people, and that led the country through a long internal armed conflict that generate several negative aspects, like or consequence, like close to 5 million of farmers of families was displaced to the countryside or was moved to the countryside from the countryside to the cities. These families lost his land. Yeah. And this process led to increase the index of the land concentration. Colombia has, like several countries in Latin America, a high index of land concentration. Yeah, with one additional problem, that is the land in Colombia. People who has the land in Colombia is not oriented to the production, to the agricultural production or livestock production. It's more, or the land is to control the territory or to have a social and political control. Yeah? No, it's not the land for production, okay? And this process favored the consolidation, sorry, it was very easy, of the specific agro-commodities and industries. In particular, the sugarcane, oil palm industry, and flowers to export. Yes, so the armed conflict or the conflict in the country was oriented or helped to consolidate these specific agro-industry sectors. Yeah. And also favored the expansion of large-scale investments in areas or in sectors like hydropower dams, building of infrastructure, mining industry, and real estate inversions. So the food is the agrarian question in Colombia is to understand the agrarian question in Colombia, we need to take different perspectives. Yes. For example, the land concentration for the speculative, not for the production, and the other interest that the capitalist has over the land. For example, to promote the extractive regime. That is, for example, I have some information about the inequality land distribution in Colombia. Close of the 70.4 of farms has the 22% of the land. It's a big problem. And the average area is about the 1.08 hectares, yeah, for family. And on the other hand, the 0.4% of the farms has the 66% of the agricultural land. Yeah, this is part of the problem in Colombia. The agreement signed by the government and the farm in Colombia create new conditions for the development of the capitalism in the countryside, particularly. Yeah, but it's important to mention that 60% of the food is produced by peasants, but only 25% of the population lives in the rural areas. Yes, the country is in the last 10 decades, 3-4 decades, has a big process of or a fast process of the moving, of the concentration of the population from the countryside to the cities. And the new phase that created the peace agreement in Colombia lead to favor the privatization of the control of the natural common property to allow the expansion of the extractive industry investments. Yes. And one element, an additional element that the peace agreement between the government and the FARC create the opportunity to access a new territories that was banned for decades by the conflict army. Yeah. So.
Can you explain FARC, because maybe people here don't.
FARC, okay. FARC is a guerrilla, a Marxist guerrilla in Colombia. FARC was really the oldest guerrilla in the West. And the guerrilla is started like a peasant movement, and with the time they transformed the peasant demands to communist or Marxist demands. Yeah, and in the last 4 years, the government started a process or a peasant process with this guerrilla, and right now they are involved in a political process. Yeah, open political process in the country. So one very interesting study case is the incorporation of the new area for the production of the agribusiness in the country. This area is the Orinoquia region, that is the green one, that is so close to the Amazonian area, and it's very important because this area is a big area in the country that don't have agribusiness production. Yeah, it's most speculative lands for the control, the socio-territorial control, and it's a big area that the property is the state has the property. Yeah, so the project is to incorporate this area for the international agro-commodity production system. This process, this is only possible, yeah, because the peace agreement signed with the FARC, yeah, because it was a very dangerous area, yeah, where it concentrated high levels of violence and repression during the 5 decades. So. The Orinoquia region are the new expansion area to provide agro-commodities to the international market, and this is possible through one specific public policy that is called the CIDRES law. CIDRES is acronym of special zones, yeah, to incorporate, to favor the capital, the large-scale investments. And in this process, the government tried to transfer public lands to private investors. Yes, this public lands is in the constitution is oriented to landless peasants, and they are the government argue that the peasants don't have the capacity and the capital to promote the inversion in this region. So the only one who have the capital and the knowledge and the capacity is the agribusiness sector. So the model is oriented to the agro-commodities production and not to the food. Yes, is planned to is the region or is planned to produce soybean and sugarcane, and also oil palm, and develop a kind of culture without peasants, and transform the ecosystem with negative environmental impacts because it's supported on kind of production the revolution packet like the agribusiness, and it's very important because the model that has is planned to introduce in this region is the same that has been promoted in Mozambique, called la Prosavana, that is influenced by the Cerrado model, that is a specific production model that was created in Brazil. It's important because Brazil had an important participation to export this kind of the specific production model in several areas, and particularly in Colombia. Okay, finally, it's important to mention that the Cedro law is supported on the speculative way, yeah, and they have several problematics because it depends on the international speculative price of our commodities. The Brazilian model in Colombia has been oriented to the territorialization of the extractive industries in a similar way to the Brazil. So this is very important because the process in Colombia are very connected with the Brazil process and lead to create also in the same way that transfer the technology, also transfer the conflictivity. And in the process of the transnationalization of the socio-territorial conflictivity. Okay, is mean in the same way that occurred in Brazil, and its process is occurred also in several places or in other places like in Mozambique with the Pro-Savannah model or program. Well, I will try to explain this big issue very fast because, well, the time is over, but thank you.
Thanks, Luca. Again, many points of comparison. I just sort of pull out two. One is the post-conflict situation, thinking in particular of our friends from Myanmar. There's some really interesting points of connection there. And also this question of the exporting of models, not only within one country and from one part of a country to the interior of that same country, but also across borders, something that's very relevant and important to consider from where we are here, as well as in Latin America and over into Africa. So thanks. And finally, last but not least, Alana is going to take us even further south. Or
in a sense. Depends how you're thinking of territory. I'd like to join, here we go. That's not going to help, the tie isn't going to help me. Oh, what have I done? Okay. It is down here, isn't it? This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, thank you. I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking our hosts, Chiang Mai University, everyone who's here in the room. It's such a pleasure and honour to talk about your research to people who really probably have a more nuanced understanding of some of the issues, certainly than we do in Australia. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well to learn from you. And thanks also again to Phil and Tub Tim. And of course our colleagues from Latin America who hosted us for the first stage of the workshop, as Phil mentioned, because this has become a really amazing and fertile partnership. So when we talk about food sovereignty in Australia, as Phil mentioned, I come from a communications background, so I'm really interested in how we present these complex political concepts to different audiences, particularly in the case of food sovereignty, to audiences unfamiliar with the struggle for rights and the struggle for land. And this is something that occurred to me this morning. We were really fortunate to talk to Sabrina, who's working on campaigns for international rivers, and who has a wide experience in training people how to deal with the media. And my background is in the media, so I understand that challenge of getting these important issues into what we might call the public sphere for debate and discussion. And in Australia, it's becoming an increasingly important, I think, an imperative to talk about food, because Australia is apparently leading the race in terms of rates of obesity increasing. So we have this bizarre overnutrition paradox, which I know we also have in Brazil, in many countries around the world, Mexico, even India. So when I talk about framing food sovereignty, I'm trying to do it for a range of audiences. And Phil also mentioned I'm working with colleagues on research about how to integrate healthy, affordable and inclusive foodscapes in cities, particularly in rapidly densifying urban environments like Sydney, where we have issues, as a lot of cities do, around space, and certainly we have issues around food availability. But I'm going to start talking about the rural, and this is a farmer, an Australian farmer. He is a member of the Lock the Gate movement. So locking the gate is a metaphor for protecting your land from a particular type of extractive industry that's become a big threat to arable farmland in Australia, and that is coal seam gas mining. Have people heard about coal seam gas mining or fracking? How would that translate? Is that an industry in Thailand? Okay. Well, it's a process that involves using a lot of water. That's one of the problems. And it's about literally fracturing the rock to access the water in the water table. Because you may know that Australia is a country that experiences a lot of drought. It's very arid, and water's obviously very precious. Therefore, farmers are really concerned about the future of their crops, because there's not a lot of research, and there's a lot of debate over how this process actually affects the quality of water, not to mention it uses quite a lot of water as well. And in Australia, unlike the United States, where this is also a common practice, in Australia you only own the surface of the land, you don't own the land underneath it. So the state actually provides licenses to the gas companies. And the farmers are not alone in this struggle. They're actually being joined increasingly by urban movements and consumers who are also really concerned about the quality of food in the future. And this has escalated with a period that Phil mentioned, which is the food price hike of 2007-2008. And that happened to coincide with the time when I was doing my research with La Via Campesina. And even though Australians weren't affected a great deal by the increases in prices, we saw becoming, I guess, coming to the fore, or coming to some type of critical point, a couple of other issues. One of them was the concentration of our retail sector. So Australia has one of the most concentrated grocery markets in the world. I think I was told last week that New Zealand actually beats us in that regard. So we call this a duopoly because there are two main players. And these supermarkets are very powerful. So a lot of you will know from your own research that the verticalisation of the value chain means that a lot of power has traditionally existed with, say, the processors and distributors. Increasingly retail, the retail part of the chain is actually gaining this influence. So according to a lot of research, and certainly my own, that's forcing a lot of farmers into what we might call price taker relationships, where they are actually forced to take cheaper prices for their produce. And that has been particularly notable with milk. We had basically a milk war where people were able to buy 2 litres of milk for $1, which in Australia is very cheap. And there's this conversation about, well, how much goes back to the farmer? The reality is, and this is not specifically about milk, but 100 years ago, farmers received 90 cents in every dollar's worth of food they produced. Today it's around 10 cents. So that gives you an idea that this rural exodus, as I've called it, is often due to the fact that people aren't able to make a livelihood by staying on the land, or they don't see a big future. So as in a lot of countries, sons and daughters may choose not to stay on the farm. So we've also got mental health issues, with farmers having very high rates of suicide and depression. So it's a very complex situation, but it's certainly not unique to Australia. But I think it does demonstrate how even very well-developed economies where food is apparently plentiful have issues to address when it comes to food security and food sovereignty, and there are a few more I'll talk about too. So these sort of pressures influenced the development of something called the People's Food Plan by an organisation that I've worked with since I finished my research, my PhD, the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. So having seen what Via Campesina was doing, for example, in Latin America, and to be frank, Australia was seeing what Southeast Asia was doing in regard to food sovereignty movements. And a group of people, including myself, started thinking about how can we actually engage policymakers and consumers in thinking about having a more local food plan. And Canada had a good example of this, so that really helped us. But what really catalysed this particular document, the development of this document, was in 2010, the Labor Party, one of our political parties, just before a federal election, proposed what they called a national food plan. And when we all looked at this national food plan, all we could see was the interests of retailers and the interests of agribusiness represented. So again, it appeared to be a done deal, you might say, that the same interests were going to be supported. So the People's Food Plan, which, as I said, is based on the Canadian policy, resetting the table, it was actually crowdsourced by about 600 people. So it was also quite a novel document in the way it was created. And I have got a couple of quotes. I'll let you've possibly read that one, but I like this one too. Why did we need to do this? The intergenerational ramifications of a national food plan policy insist upon the need to set the highest standards. It is vital to include stakeholders and participants from across the food and agricultural system, not only those with the largest economic influence, and those with the need for fresh food, particularly low-income communities, food safety quality, the loss of agricultural skills and knowledge, particularly with the age of the average Australian farmer increasing past 60. The protection of agricultural land from urban sprawl and extractive industries all make this a really essential plan. So when we talked about food sovereignty, or when we do talk about it in Australia, we have to explain what we mean by that. And this has been a big part of our conversations in different political contexts. We have to be careful how we use this term. So in our case, the sovereignty is about a freedom to choose the food that we want, produced in ways we support by people who earn a good living from its production. It's about forging a path towards conscious food citizenship based on a democratic and resilient national food system. Now, a lot of people might assume Australia ticks all those boxes, and people who know anything about Via Campesina will see how this has clearly been adapted from Via Campesina's original conception of food sovereignty as decided in the Nilini Declaration in Mali back in 2007. So it's not an original idea, but we don't appear to have achieved it yet. So talking a bit more about Australia. In Australia, I don't know whether people are familiar. Has anyone ever been? I know you've been, Jeff. We have this idea about the fair go. We propose that we're quite egalitarian and that we think that everyone should receive their slice of the pie, if you like. But there has been a lot of, if you like, exploitation identified among workers. And it's really interesting because we've previously looked at other countries, I think, and talked about the race to the bottom in terms of cheap labour. But as Four Corners, our current affairs show on the Australian Broadcasting Commission television channel, told us that food is being picked, packed and processed by exploited workers and being sold to customers nationwide. And those very, if you like, powerful retailers are participating in this. And we also had a wide range of fast food outlets implicated in this as well. And a lot of the people targeted were actually international students. So at the University of Sydney, we were starting to talk to students and realise that they might be working in another place they were working was the convenience store, 7-Eleven. Do you have that here? Everywhere, okay. So I shouldn't mention it. If anyone's working at 7-Eleven, it possibly isn't the case here, but it certainly was in Australia that people were working these incredible hours that exceeded their work permits. And because they knew that students would not raise a hand and say, I'm working too much, they were underpaying them. And so basically it was quite extreme exploitation. Also fruit pickers, backpackers. And obviously this is illegal. So again, you know, these are another really important group of stakeholders who we need to consider in this conversation. And broadening it out to this issue of food security and availability and access to food, the Second Bite organisation, an NGO in Sydney, has actually revealed statistics that 500,000 Australians go to a food bank every month. And a lot of people found that quite shocking. Now, 500,000 people might not sound like a lot of people, but Australia only has a relatively small population. What's really sad about it is about 35% of those people are children. So there is a big gap between what the social safety net provides and it's being filled by food relief organisations. So they're increasingly being called upon, if you like, to fill this gap. And what I want to close on is just talking about an issue that harks back to what Thace was saying about the particularity of Indigenous food security and identity, distribution and rights and recognition, which is an ongoing discussion in Australia that would take a much longer lecture to unpack. But this is a particularly embarrassing statistic for Australians, that 1 in 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in a household which has run out of food and they're unable to buy any more. They're more than 6 times likely than the average Australian or the other Australians to be in that situation. So they've got particularly high rates of food insecurity. So this brings up the other, if you like, quite defining concept, I think, of food sovereignty, which is this idea of the right to food, which again is something that is difficult to enforce because it draws on the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. But in theory, the Australian federal and state governments are in breach of their obligations to ensure that all Australians, and particularly the most disadvantaged, including Indigenous people, enjoy the right to food, which also includes culturally appropriate food. And what's interesting about Sydney and our project about growing food and density together and integrating these healthy, affordable foodscapes into the centre of Sydney is that a lot of the people who live in the middle of Sydney are not only threatened with eviction because of the development, but there are also many Indigenous families who have been there for generations. And it might sound strange, but within the city of Sydney itself, within the local government area, there's about an 8.5% rate of food insecurity. So again, it's not just about where you live, it's whether you have access to transport, it's whether you can afford food, it's whether you have, if you like, the ability to get food when you're elderly and you live in the top of a tall apartment block. It's all of those really complex issues. So what we want to do is unpack what's behind the lived experience of food insecurity in cities. And for me, even though food sovereignty has traditionally been very much a producer perspective, and it talks a lot about growing food, I really feel that when we think of the food system and it's so big and people in the city only see that consumption and waste end of it, if we can bring green spaces where we grow food into cities, people will understand those connections more. And also, of course, there's the social aspect of community, of eating together, producing food together, and actually sharing the experience of food. So the last quote I want to leave you with is one specifically about basically about the particular dimensions of food sovereignty that pertain to Indigenous people. The dispossessed are already engaged in a long struggle for land rights. Indigenous peoples' movements do not demand just any land, but their land. And back to Face's point, that has been a really big issue in Australia, because as she mentioned briefly, in Australia as a settler society, the Europeans turned up and pretended no one was there. And this is a really important thing to consider when we develop a food plan for Australia. If the politics of food sovereignty are going to expand beyond the collection of rights attached to food production and consumption and build the broad coalitions necessary to transform societies, I think they have to embrace diverse food generating practices and the complex land management strategies that have largely been ignored in settler narratives like Australia. So thank you. Look really forward to the discussion, and ask any questions you like about anything, really.
Just a footnote, Eleanor, the 7-Eleven here, the franchise 7-Eleven is owned by Thailand's largest multinational agribusiness, CP. You know?
Oh, it all fits together. It's all so clear all of a sudden. And if anyone wants to continue the conversation too, there's my email address.
Yeah. Well look, we are talking about continuing conversation. Let's have a break so we come fresh to the sort of comments and the discussion. And shall we break for no more than 15 minutes? There's tea and coffee outside for Southeast Asia for some time, and then invite them to give some overall comments and discussion. So, yeah.
Need a microphone, or can you hear me okay?
Microphone for the video.
So that, this one here. Okay. So just again, my name is Jeff Nielsen. So I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm a geographer there. Much of my research is in Southeast Asia. Not so much in Thailand, but a lot of work in Indonesia. So I'm going to attempt to reflect a little bit on the presentation from Latin America and Australia, and to contextualise them against some of the trends we're seeing in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia in particular. I've sort of extracted out 3 or 4 major themes that I think you might want to reflect upon. The first one is perhaps an obvious one, but the colonial histories. And so Bernardo certainly emphasised in his presentation the specific nature of the European colonisation of Brazil, and the way that that sort of shaped the historical development there of the conflicts between peasants and capitalism, between settlers and Indigenous people. And of course, when we think about Australia, and which Alana also brought up, which is a similar settler state, in terms where the colonials came from European countries, there was a very clear distinction then between the Indigenous and the settler, and that continues today. Now, of course, when we think of Southeast Asia, it's not quite like that. And so there's a very different politics of recognition going on. Yes, many countries in Southeast Asia were exposed to colonialism, not Thailand, of course, but certainly across the region there were. But it was a very different sort of colonisation, and it wasn't a settler colonisation. And so I think thinking about how that may have influenced the patterns over time, and most importantly, how that has affected then the politics of recognition today. So when we hear about the politics of recognition, I think that was a term that Thais used, referring to in particular in Brazil. And we heard about the indigenous population, but then there is also the quilombolas, which is those of African descent who are also able to demonstrate a particular cultural affinity or cultural distinctiveness, and then that led to particular types of rights. And I think thinking about that in terms of Southeast Asia is really interesting as well, because whereas the distinction, and in fact as we're all aware, the idea of indigenous people, indigenous communities is hotly contested across Southeast Asia. Of course, to talk about it in Indonesia, everyone considers themselves, except for those perhaps of Chinese or Arabic descent, consider themselves to be indigenous. And so the term doesn't have quite the same resonance or clarity that it does in Australia or that it has in Brazil. And yet, the politics of recognition and identity in some ways are quite similar. So to be able to demonstrate you have cultural distinctiveness. In Australia, we need to the Indigenous people to claim native title need to be able to demonstrate they have an ongoing link to the land. In Indonesia, where there is some sort of recognition, not of indigenous people, but instead the term that's used is traditional law communities. And so that again is more of this being able to demonstrate a cultural distinctiveness, to be able to demonstrate that traditional law has been maintained over time. And so it's very interesting that we might have people self-identifying as being indigenous, but you also need to be able to demonstrate that often to the state, to get recognition as well. And of course we're talking here in a centre for studies of ethnic studies and development, where everyone is all too aware of how that's playing out in this part of the Southeast Asia and the relationship between dominant ethnic groups and hill tribes, and then different policies, programs that might be getting rolled out here. So I guess the first theme I wanted to highlight was the different colonial histories across the region, and thinking about how that might have put in place different sorts of systems, different sorts of processes over time, and then how that then linked to debates about indigenous people. And we see the idea of a claim for ethnic territories, so I think clearly put up in terms of the spatial maps of Brazil and the different areas of indigenous protected areas, indigenous regimes. What does that mean, of course, for the rest of society? And in Southeast Asia, that tends to mean an exclusion of ethnic others. And the potential then for that to drive conflict is a lot more, I think, a live issue than perhaps it is in places like Australia and Brazil, where the idea of indigeneity is much more widely accepted. But to be able to say that there is a clearly demarcated spatial area belonging to one particular ethnic group is as we can imagine, highly problematic, and that's something I think we can discuss a bit more. A third theme, linked I think to that, is the distinction between a peasant movement and an indigenous peoples movement. I think Bernardo again sort of made that distinction, or Thais as well actually, made that very clear, that there are these two movements. And people that are involved in NGOs, for example, even those of us in academia supporting different social movements, tend to conflate the two. We tend to think that they're almost the same sort of movement. But of course they're not, and they have very, very different objectives, and they're coming from very, very different and distinct places. A peasant-based movement is often based around some sort of idea of a peasant class, and so it's very much, I guess, identifying against agribusiness, against a capitalist system, whereas an indigenous movement might be more about claiming cultural recognition. And sort of then in Indonesia in particular, there's clear conflict there going on between organisations such as the Serikat Petani Indonesia, which is a peasants movement, and then the Masyarakat Adat, and they have very, very different ideals on what they'd like to see happening in terms of agrarian change. The fourth thing, I'll go through 5 themes, right? The fourth one was the politics. And so I think what came through in Felipe's presentation, were the ongoing conflict, which hopefully is being resolved now in Colombia, but started off as a debate over political ideologies, the Marxist guerrillas that were fighting for a particular political cause. And I think the way that Bernardo also framed the development in Brazil as being one between an agrarian question and agribusiness capitalism. I think these are sort of, in Latin America, the debates about agrarian change, about land, about food sovereignty, are much more likely to be framed in terms of classic left-right politics. You know, is this a socialist debate? Is it anti-capitalist on this side? Or are these neoliberal on the other side? These are sort of classic political divides. Now, again, in Southeast Asia, my understanding of the political tensions in Thailand over the last few years is that it can't be neatly drawn around a left-right divide in politics. In Indonesia, certainly the idea of a political left versus political right in terms of either in economic policies, it doesn't really make sense. And so the way that the movements frame their own positions and how they contrast that with those I guess, who they're opposing, don't often fit within classical left-right divides. And so it'll be interesting to see how that might affect the nature of the movement in Southeast Asia. Of course, we do have the former socialist states across mainland Southeast Asia. Thailand has its own history of conflict with communists, as did Indonesia, and yet I don't think you could really say that's the dominant ideology. Now, yes, people and peasants across the region are dealing with the same issues over land, agribusiness. We only need to look at the large-scale palm oil plantations that are being developed across Indonesia, and you could frame that in a classical question of peasants being oppressed by agribusiness capital, and yet that is not the most common way of framing it. So I think rethinking the political language might be helpful. Finally, in reference to Ilana's presentation, in particular about food sovereignty debates, and I'll broaden this out slightly more to think about food sovereignty as a movement which really, you could say, originated with La Via Campesina in Latin America, came out of a particular context there. It's struggling to adapt itself to a context such as Australia, but it sort of maintains some of those underlying commitments. In Southeast, or perhaps I can say in Indonesia, the term food sovereignty is one that's now been appropriated by the state. And it's one that's used by the Indonesian state to present a very narrow interpretation of food sovereignty, which is conflated with self-sufficiency, in rice in particular. And so really, food sovereignty has become a politics over rice production. And is Indonesia importing rice? Is it exporting rice? And then everything then becomes framed around that. And it doesn't matter if that rice is produced by large-scale agribusiness on 1,000-hectare farms. That is food sovereignty, as far as the Indonesian state is concerned. Now, in Latin America, Bernardo would be disgusted at the idea that food sovereignty could be achieved on a massive 1,000-hectare estate, and yet that's exactly the way it's related in Indonesia. So thinking about the way that ideas such as sovereignty are translating across cultural divides and across states. So that's my 5 themes to hopefully get the conversation going.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff. I'm going to also offer just a few themes. I actually have 7 points down, but since you've done a lot of the work for me, I think mine might be shorter than yours. I hope so. The first I'd like to do is to take up, I guess, one of Bernardo's framing schemas, and that is the question of the idea of paradigms of the agrarian question versus agribusiness or agricultural capitalism. And I think what's important here is to look not just at the way in which the agrarian question
engages with movements at the moment, but also to look at the assumptions about the peasantry in the two regions. And that this comes back to the very, very different histories. Now, Jeff's already touched, of course, on the difference between settler states and the situation here in Southeast Asia. But I think part of that, but more fundamental here, is what we mean by the peasantry and the assumptions of the peasantry. The agrarian question coming out of Marx and more specifically out of Karl Kautsky dealt with the situation in Russia, where you had a pattern of smallholder family-based farming. And the basic question, in fact, it was in effect, as I understand it, a two-part question. The one is, what is the future of the family farm under agrarian capitalism? And the second, more important, is, and so what should those on the left do about it? And what should the political program be around it? But the assumption was that the peasantry is something that had emerged out of the feudal situation in the feudal histories of the way in which farming was carried out, and it had to do with an agrarian structure, which, as the same question was taken up with critiques of the Green Revolution and agrarian capitalism as it moved into Southeast Asia in the 1960s, 1970s, was building, of course, on a situation quite different from Russia, but on the other hand, the similarity was that it was a peasantry which had its roots not in the late 19th and early 20th century with the freeing of slaves and, if you like, the construction of a peasantry only, 100-something years before, but something which had a sense of timelessness. So, yes, different from indigenous, but at the same time deeply rooted in history. Whereas in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, as I understand you're talking about it, you're talking about a peasantry that has a very different historical and social origin to that in Southeast Asia, which means that when you raise the idea about the agrarian question, you frame it in terms of the future of the peasantry, you're talking also about a much more recent peasantry, and a peasantry that has arisen out of particular historical events like the a partial breakdown of the system of slavery and the large latifundia in Brazil. And that's very closely also related to another important point, which is the very different structure of land ownership. Both Thailand and Brazil and Colombia, they're all highly unequal countries in terms of land ownership. But in Thailand, farming is still largely smallholder based, which is very different from what you'd find in Latin America. The second point I'd like to comment on is something I was just talking about with Ajahn Ogawan in the break, is the way in which we use terms that sound familiar but in fact have different meanings. And I saw that Ajahn Anand was also kind of raising his eyebrows about the use of a term like territorialization. And as I sort of understand it and would frame it in terms of the way territorialization is discussed as part of the critical discourse on land in Southeast Asia. It has to do with a particular geographical discourse, largely to do with instrumentalities of the state that try to formalize boundaries around land and zones that represent a largely statist project against which small farmers often resist, for example, when they find themselves territorialized into national parks, like we saw yesterday. Whereas I think you're looking at territorialization, something much more encompassing. You've also got a degree of abstraction of territory and territorialization. So I think there's some interesting discussion that we need to have here. But there's also, there's literature, whether if you're looking at territorialization around the question of national boundaries, very interesting work by Tongchai Winichigo on the history of even the construction of the idea of a territorialized bounded nation state as a colonial project, but also the work that Ajahn Anand has done and Peter van der Geest on territorialization as a sort of instrumentality of power, a sort of geographical discourse against which peasants resist. There's been much less discussion, I think, about that in terms of the role of business and agribusiness. So I think there's a lot to learn from your presentation, but also, I guess, some caution in assuming that we're talking the same language, because in fact there are different meanings. The third, which I found really interesting in Felipe's, is the post-fact, the post-agreement, the post-conflict situation, because in Southeast Asia, as you know, everyone's aware that this is a region which has had its fair share of conflict. If we look over a sort of half-century period, we're talking about the conflict in Indochina and then the post-conflict situation in Cambodia, but most recently the post-conflict situation in Myanmar. It's really not quite accurate to say post-conflict. There's still a lot of conflict, including armed conflict, but part of the settlement in Myanmar has been some reduction in that conflict. And there's some very interesting work which I'll refer you to, or which you might be familiar with, in Myanmar, on what's been termed by Kevin Woods ceasefire capitalism. Ceasefire capitalism, which is all to do with exactly what you were talking about here, the openings of space, of territory, which had been sort of off limits for a period. But what's interesting here, and may or may not resonate with you in Latin America, is that part of this process of ceasefire capitalism is that those some of the leaders of the armed groups that had been in armed conflict against the Burmese or Myanmar state for half a century are now part of the capitalist process, and so that we see the sort of class relations, and we see what had been framed as a sort of ethnic conflict quickly taking on a class conflict when you look at land. So I think there's a lot of interesting potential comparison work to do here. The fourth one is, I mean, Jeff mentioned that left-right doesn't quite work, but on the other hand, I think in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia in particular, and Indochina, in this Mekong region, look at Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and even in Thailand, the experience of the armed struggle and in some cases the communist regimes that succeeded it is all important in defining not only what happened then, but also in today's landscape. If we ask, where's land grabbing going on in Southeast Asia? It's often in exactly those places that have emerged into what's sometimes termed post-socialist economies, but there's a lot of debate about whether they really are post-socialist in the political sense, in that and also in terms of the way in which land is defined as something which is owned by the state or owned by local groups and so on. So if we look at where the big land concessions are in Southeast Asia, it's in Laos, it's Cambodia, it's in those very places where spaces have been created because of the transition from a system of either collectivized or state-owned enterprises to a situation where the authoritarian state, can then hand over or lease out those areas to transnational investors. So there's that context is perhaps specific and different to what we see in Latin America, certainly different to Australia. Then there's the politics of recognition, and as you know, as I guess sort of building on what Jeff has said, and in Australia, as Alana showed us very clearly, this is all important. We always forget how recent the partial recognition of not just land rights, but existence has been for Aboriginal people. It's only since 1992, is it, with the Mabo decision, that the Australian Constitution has recognised that anybody lived in Australia before 1788. And of course it has its particular expression in terms of land with the provision for Indigenous title. But even here, highly conditional, highly restrictive, having to prove a continuous relationship with land in communities who have been displaced off their land is historically. But the other thing about the politics of recognition is that it has to do with the drawing of boundaries. If we look at the dreadful situation faced by Rohingya people in terms of recognition in Myanmar, this question of who came first and who who is a migrant? You know, at what point historically do you draw this difference? We can see how serious and sort of material are the implications of this. It's not just a sort of fighting for rights, as important as that is, but it's not just a fight. It's a fighting for existence. The sovereignty, I won't say much about the sort of content of sovereignty, but just briefly about the terminology of sovereignty. In Thailand, I mean, there is a food sovereignty movement, but when you translate it into Thai, the term for sovereignty in Thai is Adhipatai, but it isn't actually used because Adhipatai is much more closely linked to the specifically political and geographical. It isn't used. People still use food security, but then usually qualified by the explanation of what's meant by that particular approach to food security. So the term sovereignty, perhaps because it is in such a kind of touchy way, a sensitive way, related to another kind of politics, is so far not really part of the mainstream discourse of the food sovereignty debate, as I understand it. Others may have a different view. And then finally, and I just sort of mention this, but won't go into it because it's too big a topic, is that we've been talking about the state, but the nature of the state and its relationship with people and the expectations of the state by the civil society, by the population, also have very different histories. The expectations, for example, if we look at the recent history of Brazil, Bernardo talked about the neoliberalism 1, neoliberalism 2, and in between those two was a period where the Workers' Party was in power, Lula and then Dilma, of what, 8 years, 9 years? And during that time there was a great expectation of the state. There are agents of the state who can operate quite autonomously. We were talking this morning about the role of public prosecutors in Brazil, something quite unthinkable in Thailand, for example. Not only that you can have an independent judiciary, but also that within that you can have proactive, independent prosecutors who will prosecute the state on the side of the people. And so the expectation of the state, perhaps influenced partly by, also by a sort of European understanding and a social democratic understanding of the state as the expression of a liberal democratic politics, is something which sits still, I think, very uneasily in Southeast Asia, and less easily now even than it did maybe 5-10 years ago. So those are some broad comparisons. But Dan Chusak, before we open it up, would you like to make some comments?
In fact, it almost no need for me to to reflect anything, because Jeff's already give some picture about Southeast Asia and feel particularly in Thailand. So I wouldn't spend so much time on kind of repeat that again. And also we spare time for Jan Anand, who has really experience on this issue. First, when think of Brazil or South America, which is very far away from us. But you may not surprise on the street. In Thailand, if you ask people, do you know Brazil? They will probably more than 70% would know where's Brazil because of football. Right? Yeah. But for us, who do research in academic community, I think when think about South American or Brazil or Colombia, I think what we are familiar is mostly, I think, in terms of development theory, right? Like dependency theory, or that stuff that we learn in the class, but we never be able to listen to, from the first-hand researcher from South America. So that's probably. This is a good opportunity to learn from you. And the second thing that when think about Thailand or Southeast Asia and Brazil or South America, in terms of the difference, what come to my head is the scale. So we are very small. Think about as an area of the countries, the movements. Of course, we have peasant movement. We have a kind also have a kind ethnic minority, but compare with what you have in Brazil or in South Africa, you have so diverse group, and it's very clear that in Thailand we don't have a kind of indigenous peoples. I think the government try to never recognize or never think that we have that kind of people. We have the only Thai, and some small group of ethnic minorities. So that's the difference. The next point is about in terms of resort. I think Thailand, if we think I cannot think about it. We have any kind of frontier left in Thailand, compared with Brazil, which you still have really large areas inside, like in Amazon. But when you think about in terms of Thailand, frontier areas almost non-exist, I think, because it doesn't mean that, we don't have a kind of rural people, but we don't have kind of unexplored land or a resort frontier like that, But similarity that I can think about Thailand and Brazil is in terms of inequality. I think in the gap between the rich and the poor. I think we have quite similar statistic on that. And in terms of colonial experience, I think although Thailand is not formally colonized by the European, but I think when we look in terms of lands and forest management, I think we are not different from the country in the region that has been colonized by either British or French or Dutch, And to reflect on what Elena is talking about in terms of food sovereignties, I think there's a myth that Thailand usually often look at themselves as a kind of the agricultural country. The government try to make Thailand to be a kind of kitchen of the world or something like that, and that kind of image is really kind of obscure the fact that we still have a number of poor people who's maybe it's not big number of them, but they kind of struggle to have enough food or or have enough land to work on. And the commercialization of food, or monopoly of food is the tendency is not much different from Australia, where the big corporate has increasingly controlled the food production in Thailand. We do have a kind of small alternative agriculture movement, but very small. I think it's more kind of alternative that cannot become a mainstream. So yeah, I think that's the really obvious differences is that when you compare back to South America issues on the people movement or since we don't have a kind of indigenous people, so that indigenous people who face problem of marginalization or inequalities, they usually come together and group under the kind of the poor movement, a people movement, which can be the ethnic minorities, people who live in the forest, or the people who are landless, or live in the state forest land and struggle to have recognition of their land rights. So instead of call themselves as a kind of tribal movement or indigenous movement, since they're not really big number, right? So they come together as and form with other poor people, like people who live in the slum area, or landless people in different regions, people who don't have a citizenship, and kind of come together and to make it bigger movement under the people movement. Now we have the P move, kind of people movement for just society, which in there's a kind of variety of people, ethnic minority in the north, landless farmer. In the south, they have a kind of the ethnic minority like the Ulang Lawoi, the Sea Gypsy or something, who have also struggled for land right as well. So in a way, they kind of, when they come together and call themselves people movement, is more movement of the poor, right? It's in another sense, it's a kind of a class-based movement, and compare with the peasant movement that's since the 1970s, which has been harshly oppressed by the government at that time. Somehow they also ally with the kind of leftist movement, and that also inherit into the current movement of the landless farmers. So they kind of try to reconnect the history of the peasant movement with the peasant movement during 1970, which also side with the kind of leftist movement, under that context of the Communist Party movement in Thailand, So we have, a lot in terms of differences, but some similarity, but we are very small in terms of scale. That's what I can figure out. Thank you. Ajahn, you're going to have
If you ask me, I mean, I listened to some of this comparison from Australia and Latin America. I think we share many things, but like just you said, maybe the meaning may be a little bit different. But if you ask me what I can see from all this or reflect from this, I think in Thailand we seem to tie together. I mean, we don't go for a separate like land, food, agriculture, something like that. Usually, to me, we integrate all of this into environmental movement, which means how to empower people to have more power in managing forest, water, and maybe land too. Yeah. So it is more of empowering people to participate, to have more power in managing certain area. Because like lately, I went to the south. I found out that after the tsunami, destroy the mangrove forest, so the communities trying to get involved more in managing certain area. So after they can manage that, then the next question will come, whether they, because to better manage the environment or the mangrove forest, they can better do fishing, you see. So the food issue come after that. It's not the one that you try to put first, like in Latin America or in Australia. But it doesn't mean that first or second. It's just they integrate everything into a common issue of how can people manage environment or participate more, something like that. Yeah, that as far as you can see, maybe it's my bias. Oh, both, yeah, because they like if you talk about politics of recognition, they want to have some rights in managing that. Because if they can managing that, they can organize or they can form a network, and then they can negotiate more with the capitalists, like a big fisherman or big whatever, or the industry or something like that. Yeah. So I mean, they start from the environment and then form a network, negotiate for rights with the government and to negotiate more with the corporate, the capitalists. Yeah. So they have two point of negotiation with both state and the capitalists. But I think that is the first thing that I think come more to my mind in terms of how to think about all of the issues that you talk about. And the second thing, from my own observation, I think the situation in Thailand changed. We cannot focus more on the indigenous, peasant, farmer, something like that. It's difficult now. Thailand has been transformed in the past, I don't know how many years, 30 years or so, to the point that now we call emerging actors. We cannot just talk about peasant. That's my days. In the 80s, we can talk a little bit about peasant, farmer, something like that. Indigenous was very difficult, like I said, it's only referred to the people on the highland. So I think now we have to focus more on these emerging actors, who are they, you see. And from what I can see, they mean, like if you talk about farmer or peasants, or the local. Now we use more of the word local because we don't know what to talk, how to refer to all these actors, you see. So they are local, which is even vaguer, more vague, or whatever. But in fact, under that, what you can see is that now we are talking because now politics in Thailand is in such a way that we have to focus more on politics. So when we talk about emerging actors, now become more like political actors in a way. So we don't know now, because when you focus on what you have been saying is more on the economic side. You see, in Thailand we cannot separate economic and the politics. In the mainstream politics, I mean, not only the marginal politics of organizing themselves into a movement. So all of these new actors, they transform into, we now more familiar with the term entrepreneur, you see. We call rural entrepreneur, whatever entrepreneur, but the term entrepreneurship tend to be emerging as some kind of new actors. So when you say entrepreneur, we don't know what they are, now if they engage in more rubber plantation, I found out that the farmer in the Northeast, they said, I want to be rich, you see. You cannot just keep me as a poor, assembly of the poor all the time, of course, sometimes I take part in that, but you cannot just exclude me or just push me into that kind of category. They want to be rich, you see. What can we say, this is new entrepreneur. So they're trying not to exclude or isolate themselves. They can go with anybody. They go with the politics, they go with NGO, they can go with a scholar like us. They can align themselves in different issues. Yeah? So it's become more complicated now to identify whatever actors that we would like to talk about. So I think these two type of things confuse me a lot. How can we, as an academic, really understand or analyze the situation? You see, like I first talk about the environment. They would like to have more power in managing environment, and the second, the emerging new actors, they actors. If they are entrepreneurs, they tend to think that they become more individualized, but in fact, they are individuals who form their own network. You see, and the network is not only on the ground. Now I found out that they have network on the social media. The cyberspace. I mean, they use a lot of cyberspace now. When I talk to the farmer, they all have the cell phone and everything, you know. They connect, they are connected, you see. So we cannot just look at them on the ground anymore. That confused me a lot because I always stay on the ground, and now they move into the cyberspace. So we cannot really connect to this. So this is the sort of thing that we really have to bear in mind. Thailand has changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years that sometimes we cannot keep up with this pace of changing. Yeah, okay, so I identify just two things that puzzle me.
Very, very interesting. I think on that last point, I'd like to think back to something that Thais was said or showed in your talk, because, and I was going to talk about it in your comment as well, but about this idea of politics of recognition. And they say people don't, are sitting still and staying in their slot, and increasingly we find this idea not just defined from the outside of rural entrepreneur, but it's what's happening on the ground. Farmers becoming farm managers, they're living in multiple places, multiple localities. But also, even if we look at what's in Latin America or in Australia, we term it indigenous, or in Thailand it's ethnic minority politics. Debate is also dilemma about the politics of recognition being conditional on what you showed in your quote as accepting this sort of conservationist. In Cambodia, people want to claim indigenous title, and there is a provision in the Cambodian constitution, it's the only one in this region, that allows the indigenous title. But you have to dress in a certain way, dance in a certain way, speak in a certain way. You have to put yourself in this box, what Tanya Lee calls the indigenous slut. And Andrew Walker, who's an anthropologist, political anthropologist who writes about Thailand, is very critical of this, and quite early on was got in debates with a number of NGOs in Thailand, a number of academics in Chiang Mai University as well, because he was very critical of the way in which the Karen were often seen by progressive academics and scholars and NGOs as being very conservationist. But he sort of warned and said, look, if you sort of romanticize or idealize this particular way of behaving and acting as the conditionality that allows for recognition and the land rights that go with that, then you're painting people into a corner, you're putting them in this slot. So I think that these are really important issues here. I'm still not really quite clear about how much in Latin America, whether these same issues are there. But it seems to be that some people are seeing them in these kinds of ways. In Australia, I think we have exactly the same sort of things with indigenous entrepreneurship, and even, of course, a lot of debate within the indigenous community and indigenous scholarly community about this sort of accommodation between entrepreneurship, capitalism, indigenous identity, and so on.
I'd like to understand the difference between the concept of territorialization. I'd like you to explain better what the difference, because I said the territorialization is a multiplication of territory. What meaning for you when you said is it different, the sense here, the territorialization? What's territorialization mean for you here?
According to what we use here, it means imposing state power over the territory, state managed territory in such a like the national park, that we call territorialization. We impose state power over a specific area of territory, so that the state will have the exclusive power to manage that. That's why I talk about the people would like to change that.
Because I understand we have many types of territory. The state work with the territory for management. The state not create a new territory. The state change the territoriality. For example, when the state create a a new park or declare for preservation area, they state is define the territoriality of this area. But you here use the territorialization to explain this process. I'd like to change with you our articles, and we create a debate to understand how we use our concepts, because I think the process, because in Europe, for example, in UK, for example, the geographers use the territory as a space of governance only. I think in Latin America, we start to debate about the territory concept, not only space of governance, but the territory has a space of life. Not the space of governance, it's a space of life. The space of life and the space of governance is the same, but it's different. Because when, for example, Via Campesina, in 1999, the World Bank started many public policies with the government for new studies about the indigenous or peasant territory. What was the interest of World Bank? Is now this territory for controlling this territory. But the indigenous people create another definition of territory, or the peasant people. Why the World Bank see the territory has a space of governance to control, the peasant and the indigenous see the territory has a space of life, to existence. I think we need to change this difference in your study.
For me, as geographers, I think, and especially people who work in Southeast Asia, among our network, I think, like Peter Van der Kies, I think we base the concept of territoriality from Robert Sachs' books. That's Thongchai also used that concept of territoriality, but he kind of used at the national scale, right? How Thailand has been mapped, and construct as a country. And Peter Van der Kies and Nancy Peluso modify that concept and call it territorialization as a process and to explain in the case of Thailand how Thai state has, after they create the country, the national boundary, then use this process of territorialization to control people and control the resort. So territoriality is kind of how we use space as a tool of power. So after Thongchai talking about the construction of Thailand, through mappings, Peter Van der Kies and Nancy look at how Thai state continue the control of the territory, the land and resort, to prescribe or proscribe what you can do or cannot do, something like that, And like the case in national park, when you create a boundary, then you prescribe what you should do in this boundary and what you cannot do, right? So
it also implies to other policy, like even land titling. Yeah, the state issue land is also part of this territorialization. Like also building of a dam on the river, then the state can control the river. They can manage the flow of the river. And the proclamation of the special economic zone is also this, the operationalization of the concept into various policy that means the same thing. The state impose power over the management of certain resources. Yeah, we try to use this as a way to criticize or to debate or to negotiate with the government. How can we, share the power of managing those resources rather than allow the state to monopolize them?
From your explanation, it seemed to me that you kind of follow Le Fabian's concept of production of space, right? Use space of life or something that's kind of more under the comprehensive concept of space by Henri Lefebvre, a French philosopher. That's what my understanding. I listen to you.
I send one article for you about the typology of the territory. The first territory is the space of governance. The second territory is a property, and the third territory is a body, is a space in movement. I would like to invite you. I would like to invite you, everybody here, to publish in the Brazilian journal.
Brazilian journals, please.
The Brazilian, we coordinate a Brazilian journal in geography in my university. And I would like to invite everybody to publish about the geography or debate about the space of territory in Thailand. Okay, I think this is a good opportunity. We make a relationship about our ideas, our studies.
A special number of meta.
Yes, we can to create a special number of Thailand.
We can do a double special number.
This year we published. Perfect. This year we published a special number about Mozambique. And is result the one agreement with this kind we have here. We work with Mozambique and they invited the economists, sociologists, anthropologists, geographers, and they publish it in our journal. I think this is a good opportunity for the professors, for the students in Brazil now study the Thailand, because we are very distant.
Yes.
One journal closed us. It's a good opportunity.
Yeah. Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I? Yeah. So one thing that's really nice that you mentioned, you too.
Use the microphone to people that video.
Yeah. Okay. Better? Yeah. So one thing that was really nice that you two mentioned is about the tool as a power, a tool of power, the territorialization as tool of power. So one thing about territory is that we start addressing those issues around territory, thinking about the power underlying it, and thinking about much more as James Scott, that you can have different levels of power. So it could have like a daily resistance. That's also a tool of power, but power of people to change the state or to change things. So from that, we start unpacking the possibilities of thinking about what is a territory and what should be the territorialization, though. And that's what Bernardo had done a lot in geography, and some of my colleagues in anthropology and social science had done too. But always in the sense that this tool of power can come from the state, but also from the civil society and from the movements.
I think the confusion is that I understand what you're trying to say, but we reserve the concept of territoriality, the same as what you said. But the term of territorialization just
okay.
for the part of the imposing the state power.
Okay.
I understand because you have two parts. You have to try to be more dialectic, but in a way we have to differentiate. Otherwise, we don't understand. We try to criticize the state first, and then if you want that, we can say negotiated territorialization. Because otherwise it will be confusing. This is a kind of only for academic concept. Help us to better analyze rather than just because I know you try to use the concept for also protesting or something or negotiating. So we put negotiated territorialization if we want to integrate the aspect that you just point out. Yeah, but here because the concept is also imply a strategy or political movement here, So it's not just for academic use. Yeah? So we have to be better, understand clearly the context. So the context may be different. Yeah. So in that case, otherwise the political strategy will be a little bit confused. Yeah.
But
Can I do just a little thing? One more that you were talking about the politics of recognition. One thing that definition, that huge definition about the traditional population that I brought, when this was tried to be put together, so the conservation politics that people were willing to take, they were quite sensible to not try to address put those population into a board or limits of what they can do and cannot do. And so trying to see ethnicity as political, and so as something that's a living thing, that you can move the boundaries. And that's the reason why part of the definition is that these cultural traits, they are re-elaborated and restated all the times. And they are not just a title to land or to the way you use land or the way or your language or the way you dressed, but you can be re-elaborating this to actually fit the policies the way it's better, so you can have your rights recognized. So it's really more like a political tool that can be shaped to better fit a possible dialogue with the state, and so have your rights recognized. And that's the nice thing about the concept. Well, it takes a long time for us to understand that, because we were trying to understand what the movements, the indigenous organization and traditional population organization were trying to do. And so we just get the sense of how they address differently the states, the policymakers, depending. Sometimes when different ministries of the government in Brazil would come to those populations, they would address what they want and what they need and who they are in a different way. And so we need that because we have a different language, and this language has to do with where we live and the way we live. But this way we live does not mean live in a wood house, but could be live in the city, for example. But the way we live in the city, it's tied to the way we speak to the city. And so they build the whole issue around how they speak and how this language build this ethnicity and this ethnical identity they are trying to have been recognized. And that's much the case for many of these traditional communities around Latin America. And so that's one point that I maybe not explained very well. It was trying to, yeah.
I'm just looking at the time. I think we need to wrap up fairly soon. We haven't heard much from students or from people on this side. Are there one or two last questions or comments anyone would like to make from? Yes, please, Jan Muktawan.
I just have a question for our colleagues. When you mentioned about traditional people and indigenous people, so maybe since Thailand, the authority hasn't yet recognized the terms indigenous people, even though the local members of some groups would like to call themselves as such, right? So maybe we don't have any clear ideas about indigenous people, but in your context, you mentioned about traditional people and then indigenous people. I would like to learn more from your explanation. What are the differences between these two groups of people?
Very briefly. So, because of our history, we make clear that the indigenous population is the original population that already lived in the continent when the colonists arrived. Because after that, we had all the colonists and all the contact that had among indigenous population and the colonists and after the slavery. And everything that comes after that. So the traditional population have cultural traits, but they are not embedded in the face in the way that they have always been a community from that place. They were born after the colonization process, so they are part of a history of the colonization, although they have very specific cultural traits. While the indigenous population, they are pre-colonial, in a way that they own the land in the sense that they were there before. And so at some point, there was a break. Initially, they were all seen as traditional population, but there was some questioning about, oh yeah, but you cannot be traditional because you were not here. You were an Afro-descent population, or you were a mixed blood population. You cannot be recognized as traditional. And so they create this idea of traditional. It's one thing that it has cultural traits that are make you different and make you have a different relation with people and among yourself and with land that is not indigenous. So give the rights to the indigenous population, give the rights to us, because we both have rights. So that's the main difference. And it comes much more from the ground, from the the indigenous movement and other, what we now call the Forum of Traditional Communities. They organize themselves so they could actually try to pose their questions to the state and get the rights. That's, yep.
I think we better call a halt there. I think that ideally we would have our seminar from each of the speakers, but we wanted really to draw on the experience and wisdom and insights of those while they're here just this 1 week. So I'd like to thank our visitors here very much indeed, and everyone also for participating in the seminar. We'll continue the Land Series seminars over the next few months, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking you.